Dum 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 dum. The ominous music begins in the background, not as Darth Vader approaches, but as we approach chapter 20. This is lecture 20.1, Participles, Verbal Adjectives. What, I ask you, is this? Here is a mountain. This is a mountain covered in snow. And here we are, little travelers, preparing to ascend Mount Everest. The Mount Everest of elementary Greek is participles. Now, some of you think I've been going to Mount Everest every week. Why should I climb this Mount Everest? Well, several reasons. Number one, you want to pass this class and graduate from seminary. But more importantly, you want to be able to read the Bible in Greek. And 1 out of every 20 words in the New Testament is a participle. And oftentimes the structure of a passage is revealed through the study of participles. So, for example, Matthew 28, the Great Commission, there's one imperative, make disciples, and then you have these participles that hang upon it. So building the structure of a sermon or Bible lesson based on the text itself is very important. And just, we want to be able to read the words that are in the Bible. Okay. Let's start at the very beginning. What is a participle? Okay, it's kind of hard because participles in English are used different from participles in Greek on a number of different fronts. But a participle is a hybrid. It is part verb and part adjective. It's built on a verb stem. Here's our verb stem, but it's declined like an adjective, often a third declension adjective, sometimes first, but it's built on a verb stem and declined like an adjective. So, for example, here we have luantas. You may recognize this ending as a third declension genitive ending. Here is our verb stem, right? Here is our verb stem, and then here is our adjectival genitive masculine singular ending. So, as a verb, we have tense, we have voice. Of course, the mood we'll label as a participle. And then as an adjective, we have gender, we have number, we have case. I tell students that as a hybrid, as a part verb, part adjective, the participle is kind of like the Toyota Prius. Right? It's a hybrid. It's part gasoline motor, part battery powered. Or for you 80s kids out there, it's like RoboCop, right? RoboCop, who is part human and part machine. What do I mean by this? Well, let's think about it. We have this in English too, right? We can talk about the brown dog. Okay, the brown dog. Now, brown is an adjective. But we can also use a verbal adjective to describe the word dog. We could talk about the running dog. The running dog. See, there we have it's still an adjective, but it has a verbal quality to it. We could talk about the silver faucet. Silver doesn't really have a verbal quality to it. Or we could talk about the fixed faucet, right? Fixed again is an adjective. It describes the faucet, but it has a verbal. It's built on a verb stem. It has a verbal quality to it. Now, in Greek, there are 3 different ways that participles are used. They're used attributively. They're used substantively. And they're used adverbially. And let's start off by just giving an example of each one of those. First off, the attributive use. You can think about this filling the slot that an attributive adjective would fill. So, for example, we have, and I realize you don't know these forms yet, so you have to take on faith that these are participles forms. You have ha pisteuon doulos, blepe ton kurion. Hapistuo doulos, blepe ton kurion. So you can see this is, imagine for a moment that we didn't have this participle. Oops, I didn't mean to wipe it out that way, but Imagine that we didn't have the word pisteuon there. The sentence would be quite easy, wouldn't it be? The slave is seeing the Lord. The slave is seeing the Lord. Now, in this slot right here, we can put an adjective. We could say the good slave, ha agathos doulos. The evil slave, ha panegros doulos. Or we could say the believing slave, ha pisteuon doulos. The believing slave is seeing the Lord. And in English, that often gets smoothed out as a who clause, a relative clause. The slave who is believing is seeing the Lord. But if you look at it very literally, it's the believing slave. Okay, that's the attributive use, where the participle is giving an attribute of a explicit noun. There's a noun present in the sentence, and the participle is basically filling the adjective slot. Another use of the participle is the substantive, and this is where the participle functions as a noun because there's no noun explicitly present in the sentence. So if we were to say, ha pisteuon blepe ton kurion. Now, you see that the participle is here, and even though you don't know the forms yet, the article tells you it's nominative masculine singular, so it's probably functioning as a subject. Indeed, it's the subject of the verb blepe. And so the sentence without the participle is, he is seeing the Lord. He is seeing the Lord. And we could have a noun here. We could say, ha anthropos, the man is seeing the Lord. But instead, we have a participle standing in for the noun. It's very similar to using the adjective. You could say, ha agathos, the good one. The good man is seeing the Lord, using the adjective substantively. But instead, we're using a verbal adjective substantively. And so it's the believing one. The believing one, or the believing man. We're saying man because it's masculine singular, not because the word man is there. Let's just say one. The believing one is seeing the Lord. That is the substantive use of the adjective, where the participle is standing in and functioning as a noun. There's no explicit noun in the sentence that it's modifying, as opposed to the attributive, where there is an explicit noun that the participle is modifying. The third use of the participle is the adverbial. And this is the most unlike English, which makes students the most uncomfortable. And so if you're reading along here in Greek, and let's say we hit pisteuon, by now you believe this is a participle. You've seen it several times. Ha doulos blepe ton kurion. Take a look at this. And we say, okay, I understand the base sentence here. The slave is seeing the Lord. And then what is this thing doing hanging out there? Well, usually when you have an adverbial use of the participle, usually there is no, essentially as a hard and fast rule, there is no article in front of it. And we have to translate it then we have to provide some starting word in English. And in reality, it can be an if, it can be a because, it can be an although, it can be whatever the context demands. But because that's too much for beginning Greek students, we just teach you to translate it with while if it's a present participle, or after if it's an aorist. Because the present participle, some grammarians argue, I think this is debated, but some grammarians argue that the present participle expresses contemporaneous action along with the same time as the main verb, whereas the aorist participle is one step prior to the main verb. So when you say after, you communicate that. So this is a present participle, pisteuon, so we would say we believing, or while he is believing, the slave is seeing the Lord. So you see, when we have an adverbial participle, we have to provide a word like while or after. Because in English, you could, I suppose in this case, you could just say believing, comma, the slave is seeing the Lord. But in English, we normally provide more explicit connecting words like if, because, although, while, after. And so if we want our translation to sound like normal English and not biblish, a mixture of biblical language structure in English, then we're going to provide those little bitty connecting words. How you feeling? You hanging in there? Okay. if we're going to do participles, we have to be able to recognize their forms. And we need to realize that there are really only 3 tenses of participle we need to be concerned about. Do you remember the indicative mood? Let's remind ourselves with the indicative mood. With the indicative mood, we were really concerned with 5 main tenses, talking about past, present, and future. Remember, the indicative mood presents something as a statement of fact, and there is an element of time. The most important thing is verbal aspect, the speaker's perspective, but there is an element of time in the indicative mood. Past, present, future. And we talked about the future tense presents an action holistically, the present tense progressively, the imperfect tense progressively, the aorist tense, a holistic picture of the action, and the perfect tense considers the action completed, and then the state that results from that, the stative idea. Well, with the participle, there is no objective time element now. The participle will be translated in time, but it gets that purely from the context. So really, the only thing present is verbal aspect. There is no objective. That means you can't just look at a present participle and say it's in the present time. A present participle could be translated progressively in the past, progressively in the present, or progressively in the future. The only thing that's element present there is the verbal aspect, or what we called at one point speaker's perspective. So once we eliminate the element of time, we don't need 5 tenses. We just need the 3 verbal aspects. So there is no imperfect participle. And there's only like 12 old futures left over. So there's really only 3 tenses of the participle. There is the present participle right here. There is the aorist, and there is the perfect, because those 3 participles give us progressive aspect, progressive perspective. They give us that holistic perspective, and they give us that stative idea of a state that results from something. The time, however, in which we translate those different aspects is purely contextually determined. Now let's talk about tenses and forms. So remember, what are the 3 tenses that we have? We have the, and even using the word present and so on is a little bit dicey, isn't it? Because it kind of implies time, but it's really perspective. So there's a present participle. There's a reason I'm doing it in this order. There's a perfect participle, and then there's an aorist. Really, that is our 3 tenses of the participle, giving us that holistic perspective in the aorist, giving us that stative perspective in the perfect, and giving us that imperfective or progressive perspective in the present. Now, when it comes to the present, you have a present active participle, and you have a present middle passive participle. Notice that. Present active, present middle passive. So just like with the indicative mood, you have a participle that shares forms between the middle and passive voice. For the perfect, we have a perfect active participle, and then we have a perfect middle passive participle. Again, the reason I'm doing it in this order is to highlight that similarity, where the perfect also has a shared middle passive form like the present. And in the aorist, we have an aorist active participle, and then we have an aorist middle, pardon me, my brain is on. Then we have an aorist middle participle. That's why you did it in this order. You have the aorist middle participle, and then we have an aorist passive participle. Notice that's like the indicative mood, where the aorist also has 3 distinct paradigms. It does not share forms of the middle and the passive. Let's think about these forms now, and I'm gonna put up here what you need to memorize to really recognize these. What you need to memorize for the present. Remember, we have masculine, feminine, neuter. We have nominative, genitive, dative, accusative, and so on. And the forms that you really need to memorize here are luon, luusa, luan, and then the genitive masculine, luantas. Luon, luusa, luan, luantas. So when I say to you, present active when I say to you present active participle, you should say luon, luusa, luan, luantas. That is like if you go into a room and they have little hangers for your coat in the corner. This is like the little hangers, so that any form you get, you can hang on that. This will give you a place that you can check, oh, that's what it's coming from. Why are we memorizing these these four forms? Because masculine follows third declension, feminine first declension, neuter third declension. And so just like in an earlier chapter where we had a 3-1-3 pattern, 3-1-3, we have to memorize that genitive form to get the stem, right? That stem, the stem is actually, let me see if I can really erase what I just put there. The stem, we get the stem by cutting the os off. So the stem is luant. So all the rest of the masculine builds on luant, and all the rest of the neuter builds on luant. And if you look in the chart, if you memorize luon, luusa, luan, luantas, you memorize those four forms, you should be able to hang any of these other forms on the top of the chart. So there's not room to write all those out here. Now let's talk about translation. You're like, yeah, but how do you translate this? Well, that's the problem. How do you translate it apart from context? Because it could be substantive, it could be attributive, it could be adverbial, right? We don't know how to translate the participle apart from context. So let's just pretend for a moment that it's a substantive and it has an article in front of it. There's not room to write the article in front of it. But let's imagine that it's substantive, so it's functioning like its own noun. So let me give a translation here. Luon would be the man who is loosing. Luusa, the woman who is loosing. Luan, the thing that is loosing. Luantas, of the man who is loosing. Luanti, to or for the man who is loosing. Luanta, the man who is loosing as a direct object. In the plural, the men who are loosing. And so you can see we're trying to translate it with loosing to bring out that progressive aspect. And when we translate it as a substantive, we have to provide the man who, the woman who, the one who, the thing through who, those who. We're providing that for the substantive translation. We're going to see a lot of examples of translation, so hopefully that'll make more sense soon. All right, on our long journey of participles, here we go. All right, we think about with the present middle passive participle. You have, again, masculine, feminine, and neuter. You think about nominative, genitive, dative, accusative, and so on, singular, plural. And there are really only three forms we need to learn here. Luamenas, luamenas, luamene, and luamenon. Luamenas, luamene, and luamenon. You can see this is built very regularly. Lu stem plus an omicron connecting vowel plus the men morpheme plus our first and second declension endings. So first and second, this is nice. It's like phone, anthropos, doron all over again. I tell students a little memory device where when they see that men morpheme in there, right, when they see this thing, they can think passive, right? The problem of men in the church. There are too many passive men in the church, and they're often sitting in the middle of the pew. So middle passive, just those passive men sitting in the middle of the pew doing nothing. So when you see that men morpheme, think the problem of middle passive. This is probably a middle passive thing. So luamenas, luamene, luamenon. Notice this could be translated either as a middle or as a passive. So only the context. And again, just for simplicity's sake, we'll do a substantive translation. First, we'll do it as a passive. So ha luamenas would be the man who is being loosed. He luamene, the woman who is being loosed. Ta luamenon, the thing that is being loosed. Of course, as we would go down through the line, to be of the thing that is being loosed, to or for the thing that's being loosed, the thing that is being loosed, the things that are being loosed, of the things that are being loosed, to or for the things that are being loosed, the things that are being loosed. And how about for the middle translation? Let's just do the middle translation. It would be the man who is loosing for himself, the woman who is loosing for herself, the thing that is loosing for itself. All right, hang in there. Trust me, this isn't easy for me either. Okay, so now to the perfect participle. And you're going to memorize those big 4 forms there. I'm not going to write out the masculine, feminine, neuter because of space, but the 4 forms you need to memorize is le lukos, le luquia, le lukas, and le lukatas. Le luko, so that's the masculine nominative singular, the feminine nominative singular, the neuter nominative singular, and then the genitive masculine singular. Le lukos, le luquia, le lukas, le lukatas. Notice we have some things we're familiar with here. We have reduplications, right? Notice that. We have kappas. Oh, we love kappas because when we have reduplication kappa, we know it's the perfect. Remember, we have to memorize that genitive form to get the stem, so we can cut that off and say everything else in the masculine and the neuter is going to build on that le lukat stem. We don't have to memorize it twice because it's the same over here. So it's going to build on that le lukat stem. So it's third declension, first declension, third declension, 3-1-3 pattern. Again, it's very difficult. It's impossible to translate the participle apart from context, but let's imagine for a moment we'll do a substantive translation. Imagine there's an article here, so it would be, let's see if I can indicate what I'm doing here. So lelukos would be the man who has loosed, leluquia, the woman who has loosed, lelukas, the thing that has loosed, lelukatas, of the man who has loosed. And then we go on down to be 2 or 4, the man who has loosed. The man who's loosed is a direct object. The men who have loosed, of the men who have loosed. 2 or 4, the men who have loosed. The men who have loosed as a direct object. So you can see the case system still applies, and the 2-4 for the dative and the of with the genitive. Now, the perfect middle passive participle. Remind ourselves here we have shared middle passive forms. And so the forms here, again, masculine, feminine, neuter, is le luminos, le lumine, and le luminon. This is nice and regular after what else we've experienced. Notice I've given a little extra time for this chapter, like we got a week for participles because it is Mount Everest. You at least need a week to climb Mount Everest, don't you? How generous of me. So we come here, we notice that these have reduplication. There is no kappa because these are middle passive. We have that middle passive morpheme, men, men, men. If you think about how this is being built, it's very predictable. You have your reduplication, you have your stem, you have your middle passive participle morpheme men, and then you have your first and second declension endings that are being stuck onto the end of that. So la luminos, la lumine, and la luminon. If we do a little translation here, imagine again a substantive translation, so it would be let's start off with a passive translation. So the man who has been loosed, the woman who has been loosed, the thing that has been loosed. Now try the middle. The man who has loosed for himself, the woman who has loosed for herself, the thing that has loosed for itself. If we go on down, of the thing that is loosed for itself, middle, 2 or 4, the thing that is loosed for itself, the thing that is loosed for itself as a direct object, the things that have loosed for themselves, of the things that have loosed for themselves, 2 or 4, the things that have loosed for themselves, the things that have loosed for themselves. If I don't make some crazy mistake and not notice it in the midst of this, you and I will both be surprised because as I'm writing and talking, it's very likely I'll say something crazy that I won't notice. Okay, now moving to the aorist participle. Remember, we have 3 different tenses of the participle because we have 3 different verbal aspects: progressive, stative, and with the aorist, this holistic perspective. Your textbook calls it aoristic perspective. It's a holistic perspective. I don't want to confuse you on terminology as long as you understand the point. Okay, now let's think about the big 4 forms you have to memorize. Remember, what I'm writing on this page right now are the forms that you need to memorize to be able to fill in on a quiz, but more importantly, to be able to recognize participles when you run into them in translation. So again, masculine, feminine, neuter. Here we have lusas, lusasa. This makes me think of the Lion King, Mufasa. Ooh, I'm shaking when I say it. Lusas, lusasa, lusan, lusantas. Lusas, lusasa, lusan, lusantas. Now, someone here is wondering, hey, I thought that was an aorist participle. Why is there no augment? Because augment means past time. And this participle, the time, is completely relative. It's referring to the action as a whole, but it can refer to the past, present, or future. Notice we do have some good friends here with the aorist participle. We have our sigma alpha in virtually all these forms here, so that makes it easier to recognize. We do have to memorize the genitive form to get the stem, lusant, that the rest of the masculine and the neuter builds off of. If we don't memorize that genitive form, then we're in trouble, because this builds in a 3-1-3 pattern. Third declension pattern, first declension pattern, third declension pattern. The entire paradigms are in the book, so I encourage you to get out your highlighter and your pencil and kind of start with these 4 forms and then see how it builds regularly. And if you know these 4 forms, you can recognize the other ones. Let's give a substantive translation of these, imagining they have the article. So ha lusas would be the man who loosed. He lusasa, the woman who loosed. Ta lusan, the thing that loosed. Tu lusantas, of the man who loosed. Now, even as I do that, let's go back to this first form, lusas here. Within context, that could be the man who loosed, the man who looses, or the man who will loose, right? Let's think about that. The man who loosed, the man who looses, or the man who will loose. As long as it's describing the action simply, it could be translated in the past, the present, the future. The time is relative. The time is relative. Now, your textbook teaches that the aorist participle is normally translated prior to the main verb, but that's if that is a rule, I question it based on the evidence. If that is a rule, it's a rule that's often broken. Okay, now going on to the aorist middle participle. Notice, unlike the other 2 tenses we did, there's a distinct middle and there's a distinct passive paradigm. So again, masculine, feminine, neuter. We have lusamenas, lusamene, and lusamenon. Lusamenas, lusamene, and lusamenon. And notice how that is being built. We have a lu stem of the verb plus the sigma alpha for the aorist plus the men morpheme that we're used to for the middle passive morpheme for participles plus our first and second declension endings. We're grateful, aren't we, for sigma alphas, because when we see those, we're expecting the aorist. We're grateful as well for that men morpheme, because we think about it helps us think about men in the church, the problem of them sitting in the middle of the pew and being passive. Although this one, notice, is only middle. This is only middle. It is not passive. So again, giving a substantive translation, imagining the article is with each of these. How would we translate these? How would we translate these? Halusamenos would be the man who loosed for himself, noting that we could, in another context, the man who looses for himself or the man who will loose for himself, right? This important thing is the simple action, but we're just going to default here. The man who loosed for himself, the woman who loosed for herself, the thing that loosed for itself. That middle idea of doing something in one's own interest. Then we have the aorist passive. So the final paradigm here that you're responsible for memorizing, in this case, 4 forms for. Remember, it's going to be, again, it's going to be masculine. Let me get this here. It's going to be masculine, feminine, and neuter. Again, nominative, genitive, dative, accusative, and so on. And so let me write here. You're going to memorize luthase, luthasa, luthen, luthentas. Luthase, luthasa, luthen, luthentas. And if you memorize those 4 forms, then you should be able to recognize all the other ones. Notice we're gonna need to, pardon me, should include the tau in that. We cut the os off, and that's our stem, luthent, that the rest of the masculine builds off of, just as the neuter, luthent, builds off that same stem, because it follows a third declension, first declension, third declension pattern. Luthase, luthasa, luthen, luthentas. Notice we have this theta. We're glad for the theta, because it reminds us that Bill is sitting there watching ESPN in his big easy chair, feeling passive. It reminds us this is a passive participle. It is an aorist passive participle. How would we translate, in this case, the aorist passive participle? Let's imagine a substantive translation again, a substantive translation. So imagine an article in front of each one of these, and we'll go through it. Haluthes would be the man who was loosed. Haluthesa, the woman who was loosed. Taluthin, the thing that was loosed. And tuluthintas, of the man who was loosed. Wow. What kind of progress are we making here? This is crazy. Okay, let's note a few other things while we have this page here. A few other things. An interesting thing could happen with if we go back over here to the present active participle. If you cut off those endings, on, usa, on, ontas, that is the participle of a me. Now, we can be grateful for that because that means we don't have to learn some other weird paradigm for a me. We just cut the present active participle endings off, on, usa, on, ontas, and all the other ones, and that's the participle of a me. Someone's saying, how would that be translated? Being, or in context, it often will be translated like is. The man who is being the king, the man who is the king, or something like that. We also need to note if a noun has a second aorist or a second perfect. Think about that. If he has, pardon me, a noun. See, that's where I said something crazy. If a word has an irregular aorist, a second aorist, or an irregular perfect, then we're going to expect its participle to build on that irregular stem, right? Because the participle will build on the same stem. So, for example, let's imagine that we have the verb lego. You have the verb lego. And you want the aorist participle of lego. Well, you could say, oh, I know that. The aorist are lusasa. So it would be leg plus sas. And so I know that probably combined. So the aorist participle is lexos. And you say, eh. And you say, what did I do wrong? And so I say, well, let's go back. What is the aorist of lego? And you say, oh yeah, the aorist of lego is the second aorist, apon. Well, if we have a participle, it's going to build on that second aorist stem, ape. Let me look at another example that might illustrate this a little bit more clearly. Let's say blepo. What is the aorist of blepo? Or harao is what your grammar teaches it as. The aorist of harao is adon. And when you memorize adon, you're memorizing it with the augment and you're memorizing it with the imperfect ending. So participles don't have augment, so we take that off, take that ending off. The participle stem is id. And then just as the second aorist indicative used imperfect endings, second aorist participles use present participle endings. Isn't that crazy? So how do you know it's second aorist? You know by the stem, not by the ending, because the ending will be the present participle ending. Idon, idusa, idon, idontas. Crazy so much. You're like, stop. Please stop. Pause the video. This is a video. You can pause it. If you need to stop, go eat some ice cream. Okay, so idon, idusa, idon, idontas. Those are present participle endings. And to be honest, when students start reading the text, they'll often hit something like idon. They'll be like, oh, I know that. That's a present participle. And I'll say, well, what verb is it from? And they'll be like, oh, it's from I don't know a verb like that. And I'll say, do you think it could be from adon? Oh, yeah, it's building off the second aorist stem. I know it's an aorist participle because of the stem. Second aorist participles use second aorist stems and present participle endings. Let's think about one other example. A very common participle in the New Testament is built off the second aorist of erchomai. What is the second aorist of erchomai? It's eilthon. And remember, you are memorizing that with an augment on there and imperfect endings. So when we yank the augment off, we're left with the stem elth. And then we use present participle endings. So the participle is elthon. Isn't that weird? Elthusa. Don't throw something at your computer. Elthon. Elthontas. It's not the computer's fault. Elthon, Elthusa, Elthon, Elthontas. And that would be, going, well, you know, again, it's impossible to translate apart from context. But if we had the masculine, ha elthon, the man who's going, hey elthusa, the woman who's going, ta elthon, the thing that is going, tu elthontas, of the man who is going, and so on. How much further to go? How much more? We're getting closer. We're getting closer. Okay, so we've done all the forms. We've talked about the uses of the participle, but we still are left with a question. How do I translate, right? How do I translate the part? How do I know which use to translate? How do I know whether to say it's adverbial, attributive, or substantive? Well, we have a little flow chart, and I'll post a cleaner copy of this, so you might just want to pay attention and try to absorb the concept and not copy it all, unless it helps you to write it down. And so when you come to a participle, first you have to be able to recognize it. So you've got to study the forms. And then when you come to it, you say, is there an article, a Greek article, in front of the participle? Is there a Greek article in front of the participle? And it might be separated by the negation word may or something like that, or it might have a duh that's stuck in down there. But is there an article before? Usually it will be right before it. It might be separated by a little word or something. Is there an article with that participle? And if the answer to that is no, then that participle is being used adverbially. And so what that means is we're going to jump start that simplistically. Now we're saying the rule, we'll use a while if it has a present participle. We'll use after. If it has an aorist participle, we'll make a little clause, put a comma, and then we'll go on with the rest of the sentence. We realize we're whispering because we can't handle the truth on this, but we're realizing that it could be translated because, it could be translated if, it could be translated although, it could be translated all these different ways, but that's too much. We're not gonna talk about that right now. Okay, so the initial question, is there an article in front of the participle? I told you this was the Mount Everest. This is as hard as it gets. Okay, so hang in there, and you can do it. Is there an article in front of the participle? If the answer to that is yes, there is an article in front of the participle, then there's a second question we have to ask. Is there a noun? Is there a noun there, usually right next to it, that matches? Is there a noun there that matches the participle? Boy, my handwriting is atrocious. Case, number, and gender. So is there a noun there next to the participle that matches case, number, and gender? If the answer to that is yes, then the participle is being used attributively. It's being used attributively. And so we saw an example like the believing king. The believing king, it's used like an adjective. But oftentimes in English that will be rendered as the king or the person who is believing. So an attributive use of the participle is often rendered with a who clause, a who relative clause. So back here, initially the question, is there an article in front of the participle? Right? That's the question we're starting. And let's say the answer is yes. And then we say, is there a noun that matches the participle, case, number, and gender? And if the answer to that is no, hey, no, there's an article there, but there's no noun there that matches it, case, number, and gender, then that participle is almost certainly functioning as a, there's always a footnote. It might not functioning as this just full disclosure, this flow chart works 95% of the time. So there's some little exceptions, but that's pretty good for Greek. So if the answer is no, there's no noun that matches it, case, number, and gender, even though there is an article, it's a substantive. And so what that means is that in English, we're going to have to provide words like the one who, or those who, or the men who, the people who. We have to provide a structure to turn that in English, to turn that participle into a noun type thing. One more page and we're done. Believe me, we're almost done. I feel guilty lecturing this long on the participle, but quite honestly, it's very challenging to squash this into one lesson, okay? But we're doing the best we can here. One more page here with two ideas. You're like, hang on, you said one page and then you snuck something else in there. Okay, so there's another use of the participle which he just briefly introduces to you. It's really easy. It's called the periphrastic use of the participle, just the form of a me plus the participle. So, for example, if I say Amy didaskon, there, see, even my hands are starting to fail me. Amy didaskon would be translated, I am teaching. So you're often just translating the participle here as an ing form of the verb, and it highlights the verbal aspect, maybe highlighting the progressive aspect more than simply didasko, right? Didasko is also translated I am teaching, but when we render it in this periphrastic way, it puts more emphasis on this verbal form, this verbal adjective, which only has verbal aspect, does not have time, and so probably brings greater emphasis to that progressivity. The final thing, the genitive absolute. Oh my goodness, the final thing for this lecture. So you're reading along in Greek, and suddenly you hit a genitive noun out of nowhere. You're like, huh? And then there's a genitive participle too. Whoa, what's going on? And then the rest of the sentence, it seems totally disconnected from it. Altas, blepe, ton, kurion. You're like, what's going on with that? Ah, that is a genitive absolute. It's a genitive structure, right? It's a subset. If we had the adverbial use of the participle, this is sort of a subset of that. And it's a special adverbial use of the participle where you have a participle in the genitive. It's just a random grammatical structure. Don't try to figure out why it's in the genitive. And then you have a noun in the genitive, the noun functioning as the subject of that verbal idea. And we're going to render this as a little dependent clause, so usually temporally. So while the slave, time is completely relative. We see the main verb is in the present, so maybe we'll translate in that time. While the slave is loosing, comma, he sees, or he is seeing the Lord, period. So we end up rendering this genitive noun and this genitive participle as a subject and a progressive verb. It's progressive because it's a progressive participle. And then we have to jump start it in English with the appropriate word, usually temporal, though we realize within context it could be because, if, although, and so on. Wow. Here we are. That's amazing. It's dark outside. It's time for me to go home. This is video lecture 20.1, Participles, Verbal Adjectives.